Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a retired Marine buys 7 quiet acres in Colorado, he thinks the battlefields are behind him. But when a ruthless HOA queen tries to steal his land with lies, forged maps, and brute force, he realizes one truth: the war for peace has only just begun. And this time, he's not backing down. When I left the Corps, I didn't think I'd find anything more peaceful than the back of a reconnaissance truck, engine humming beneath me and the world dead silent around. Turns out, I was wrong. 7 acres just outside of Cedar Hollow Hills, Colorado gave that silence a whole new flavor. Real silence. The kind you earn with a title deed, a few busted knuckles, and a chunk of land so wide it swallows your footsteps. I bought it after retiring from the Marine Corps and working another decade as a survey contractor. I wasn't looking for much, just enough space to build a home for me and Julia, my wife of 19 years, who deserved to see mountains out her kitchen window instead of chain-link fences and nosy HOA committees. The lot was perfect, sloped a bit to the east, dotted with dying wild sage, bordered on one side by a drainage ditch and on the other by a strip of long-forgotten county-owned land. That little patch, an ugly, weed-ridden half-acre, was what caught my eye. Nobody wanted it. Hell, it hadn't been mowed since Clinton was in office. I went through the county, filled out the paperwork, paid the back taxes, and bought the thing outright. Merged it with my existing parcel. Had it properly surveyed. The flags were placed, the GPS data logged, and the property line shifted cleanly another 70 feet west. No ambiguity, no wiggle room. I didn't hear a single peep from anyone during the process. Not until I put in a temporary post and beam fence with a modest private property, no trespassing sign hung on it. Suddenly I had neighbors with opinions, or more specifically, one neighbor. Her name was Karen Hudson, and she lived in the white brick monstrosity across the way. The kind of place with manicured hedges, artificial turf, and HOA-approved flower beds in strict red, white, and blue. She was about 50-something, always in pressed linen slacks and tennis shoes that had never touched a gym floor, and spoke like someone who believed every sentence should end in a passive-aggressive warning. The first time we met, I was unloading concrete pavers from my truck, sweating like a sinner in church. She marched across the cul-de-sac like she owned the air between our properties, and without so much as a hello said, "That sign you put up, it's a bit misleading, don't you think?" I blinked. Misleading how? She smiled like a crocodile in a boutique hat. "Well, that's a community access path. Always has been. We've used that space for years. It connects the properties nicely. HOA tradition." I wiped the back of my neck with a towel. "That space is now part of my land. I bought it from the county 3 months ago. It's surveyed, filed, and recorded." Karen sniffed like she smelled something rotten. "I understand you're new to the area, Mr. Race, but here in Cedar Hollow Hills, we've always treated that stretch as communal. There's precedent. I've driven my truck through there for over 10 years. I didn't respond right away, partly because I didn't trust myself to speak politely, partly because I was trying to calculate whether she was delusional or just arrogant. In the Corps, we had a saying, assume incompetence before malice. Karen made that hard. "Well," I said, tossing another paver to the ground, "I'm not here to change traditions that work, but I'm not keen on people tearing up land I paid for. If you need access, you're welcome to ask." Her smile thinned like plastic left in the sun. "You'll find that around here, we don't always ask, but I'm sure you'll adjust." She turned on her heel and walked off like she'd just given a TED Talk. I stood there, watching her retreat to her fortress of HOA righteousness, wondering if maybe I should have gone farther into the hills. Julia called from the house asking if I needed water. I just nodded, already knowing this woman wasn't going to let it go. 3 days later, I came outside early, sun just beginning to rise, coffee in hand, and saw it. A fresh set of deep tire tracks running across the lower edge of my new parcel. They cut clean through the section I just leveled for a future carport. Mud churned, topsoil slashed. A wooden stake marker had been snapped in half and thrown to the side like a broken toothpick. The sign I'd put up? Gone. Only the post remained, bent inward like someone had clipped it in reverse. I stood there a long minute. Then I walked the full line of damage, boots sinking into fresh ruts. I didn't need GPS to tell me it had come from Karen's direction. Those tracks led in a perfect arc from her driveway across my land and back onto the service road. No other neighbor could have approached from that angle. And frankly, no one else had the ego Or the truck. The next morning, it happened again. Deeper ruts. This time, she'd driven over the temporary irrigation pipe I'd laid out for the raised bed garden. Bent it to hell. I found the crushed remnants of the junction fitting lying in the dirt like broken bones. Julia was furious. I was quiet. I don't yell when I'm mad. I build fences. Or in this case, I started drawing up plans for a real one. I hadn't installed cameras yet. That was my mistake. But something told me I wouldn't have to wait long for another visit. On the third morning, I found my tool shed, just a small aluminum structure bolted to a concrete pad, knocked clean off its footing. Not completely, but enough to shift it sideways by a good 8 inches. It looked like something had clipped it at low speed. Inside, my level battery drill and a case of screws were scattered like dice. And parked back in her driveway, clean as a showroom model, sat Karen's oversized black pickup with a faded HOA sticker on the bumper and a smug sense of belonging. That was it. I grabbed my clipboard, went to my records, and started mapping every inch of the property. I knew this land better than anyone. I had the legal documents, the GPS coordinates, and the sheer bloody-mindedness to see this through. Karen had picked the wrong man to try and intimidate. And she sure as hell picked the wrong property. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't anger keeping me awake. Not exactly. It was the old Marine instinct whispering that a breach of perimeter only happens once by accident. Twice means someone's testing you. 3 times means they think you won't fight back. That idea sat in my chest like a sandbag. By dawn, I had a plan. Nothing fancy, just a small motion-activated camera tucked inside an old contractor's hard hat I zip-tied to a branch overlooking the area she'd been using as her personal racetrack. Julia watched me from the porch with her arms crossed, shaking her head like she already knew what I'd find. The day crawled by with that uneasy quiet the land sometimes gets before the weather changes. Around early evening, I checked the camera feed on my phone and froze. There she was, Karen, in her glossy black pickup, rolling onto my land as casually as if she owned the deed and the sky above it. She didn't stop. She didn't slow. She swung the wheel, did a wide, lazy arc, and sent one of my cement buckets flying like she was practicing for some backwoods demolition derby. She didn't even look back. I downloaded the footage, slapped it on a thumb drive, and called the sheriff's office. When the deputy finally called me back, his tone held that careful politeness cops reserve for boring disputes. "Sir, this looks like a civil matter. Nothing shows intent. She may have mistaken the boundary." Mistaken? Right. With tire marks so clean, they might as well have spelled her name. When I confronted her the next afternoon, she answered the door with a smile so fake it should have come with a warning label. "Oh, Mr. Race," she said, leaning on her door frame. "If you're here about the little mishap, that was purely accidental. The boundary isn't clearly marked." "It's marked on record," I said. "And on the ground." She shrugged. "Not well enough." She said it like she was giving me advice on home decor. I walked away before I said something that would make Julia need to bail me out. That night, I decided the fence needed to go up sooner rather than later. I spent the next day renting an auger, setting posts, mixing concrete, and installing temporary steel panel gates with an electric lock I'd salvaged from a job. I also added a new sign, bigger and clearer. Private property. Video surveillance in use. No access. It wasn't subtle, but subtle hadn't gotten me far. For 2 days, things were quiet. Suspiciously quiet. On the third morning, just past dawn, I walked down the edge of the property and felt my stomach drop. The gate was gone. Not open. Gone. The cut marks on the metal were clean and deliberate, like someone had taken a grinder to it. The locking mechanism lay in the dirt in 2 sad halves. A section of the steel paneling was dragged several yards away and bent in a shape that looked disturbingly like an apology. But that wasn't the worst part. My ATV, which I'd parked behind the fence, was missing. I followed the faint tread marks until the land sloped downward, and I saw it. My machine, half tilted in the ravine, nose first in a patch of tumbleweed. Someone had rolled it downhill like a toy truck. I called the sheriff again. This time, they sent a patrol car. While I was talking to the deputies, I saw Karen approach from her driveway, waving one manicured hand like she was strolling over to a bake sale. "Officers," she said breathlessly, "I can explain. We had what you might call an emergency situation. That gate," she pointed at the mangled heap of steel, "was blocking the fire lane access for our community. I had to act to keep the area safe." "That was my property," I said. She didn't even blink. Your ATV was obstructing the path. We had to move it." The deputy looked at her the same way you'd look at a raccoon that just wandered into a bank lobby. "Ma'am," he said, "there's no registered fire lane here. This land is an HOA jurisdiction." Karen's expression tightened just a fraction, but she recovered quickly. "Well, it is a traditional emergency access. For years. Everyone knows that." I could have laughed if I weren't so angry. "Karen," I said, "you cut a locked gate and shoved my ATV down an embankment. You damaged private property." She clasped her hands together as if she were praying. "I acted for community safety. The HOA will fully support that decision." The deputy took both our statements, his face unreadable. When he left, he gave me a quiet nod like he understood exactly what kind of circus I was dealing with. As for Karen, she strutted back to her house like she had just solved world hunger. Julia didn't say much when I told her what happened. She just put her hand on my back and said, "She's not stopping. You know that." And I did. I knew it as clearly as I knew the lines on a topographic map. This wasn't confusion or a misunderstanding. This was a challenge, one she thought she'd already won. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I drove down to the county recorder's office with a folder so thick it needed its own seatbelt. Inside were my land acquisition papers, tax receipts, survey maps, GPS logs, time-stamped drone shots, and even the original invoice from the county clerk when I paid to absorb that half-dead scrap of land Karen was now pretending was the community's. Front porch. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to check what the hell she was up to. The clerk, a bored woman in her early 60s with a peppermint in her mouth and readers on a chain, typed my parcel number into her terminal. She squinted at the screen, then leaned in closer. "That's strange," she muttered. "What's strange?" "Well, your lot boundary was updated last quarter, yes, merged with the old unclaimed parcel. But there's a pending correction request from the Cedar Hollow Hills HOA." My gut tightened. "Correction for what?" She clicked around, then turned the monitor so I could see it. A new overlay map showed my western boundary shifted inward by about 12 feet. Enough to cut off the flat area I'd just prepped for the greenhouse. Enough to invalidate my fencing permit. Enough to explain why Karen was suddenly acting like she had God's permission to mow tire tracks through my dirt. At the bottom of the screen was a PDF attachment labeled Zoning Adjustment Petition, Community Easement Access, Section 3B. It had a fake-sounding letter from someone claiming to be the HOA zoning liaison, citing decades of customary access and unrecorded communal usage paths. I scrolled to the signature, Karen Hudson. I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds, jaw clenched, knuckles going white around my folder. "This was filed 2 weeks ago," the clerk said. "Still under review, but it's been flagged as non-emergency correction. You can dispute it formally." "Oh, I will." I left that office like I was walking out of a war room, drove straight home, skipped lunch, and pulled out my field gear. Within the hour, I had theodolite points set up along the western line, confirming every coordinate I'd submitted months prior. I even brought out the high-end GPS tracker I kept for topography contracts, precise to within a third of an inch. I cross-referenced everything. It all lined up. She had tried to rewrite my property with a crayon on top of a satellite map. And worse, she'd almost gotten away with it. That evening, I returned to the recorder's office with a full printed rebuttal packet, my own certified plat map, a signed affidavit from the surveyor I'd hired during the purchase, plus time-stamped drone footage I'd taken of the expansion process. I attached a cover letter titled, in bold, Objection to Fraudulent Zoning Petition by Third-Party Entity. The clerk's eyes widened slightly. "You came prepared." "No offense," I said, "but you don't win land wars with sticky notes." She smiled a little. "We'll escalate this immediately to the planning board." But that wasn't enough. I knew Karen wasn't just winging it. This was premeditated. She filed forged documentation with a county office in an attempt to alter legal property lines. That crossed the line from entitled to criminal. I called my attorney, Craig Dawson, ex-prosecutor turned real estate specialist. We'd worked together on a boundary dispute near Fort Collins a few years back. Craig didn't even let me finish my story before he said, "That's attempted fraud and boundary tampering. She's impersonating a zoning official. You need to file a separate complaint with the district attorney's office." I'll walk it in myself. By the end of the next business day, a formal complaint had been submitted. Attempted manipulation of recorded boundary data via forged submission. Ref. Karen Hudson, Cedar Hollow Hills HOA. Meanwhile, I reached out to a friend at the GIS department and asked him to flag my parcel in the system as under dispute due to potential external fraud. That wouldn't stop someone like Karen, but it'd slow her down, and I needed every second. Back home, Julia stood at the edge of the damaged greenhouse pad, her hands on her hips. So what's the story now? She's trying to move the border, I said. 12 feet. Julia turned slowly, blinking like she misheard me. 12 feet? She filed it with the county, cited community easement traditions, claimed the land has always belonged to the HOA. Julia's voice dropped. You gonna kill her or sue her? I'm going with the legal option for now. We both laughed, but not for long. I added new signs to the temporary fencing, not the polite kind anymore. These were sharp, printed metal with language that said exactly what I wanted it to. This is not a public access road. Any alteration of property lines is a federal offense. Violators will be prosecuted. I knew it wouldn't stop her. Karen was testing for weaknesses inch by inch. But what she didn't realize was that she'd finally stepped into my arena. She'd faked a map. I was a goddamn surveyor. Game on. It happened on a Thursday night, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. Just the dead middle of that dark stretch when your mind is too groggy to know if what you're hearing is real. But the sound that woke me wasn't subtle. It was the crunch of tires over gravel and the unmistakable rev of a diesel engine. Not once. Not passing by. It lingered. I sat up fast. Julia stirred beside me. I didn't wait to explain. I grabbed my jeans, shirt, boots, barely laced them, and hustled down to the back patio with my flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. The security feed lit up before I even got to the door. 2 trucks. One white contractor flatbed. The other, no surprise, Karen's black pickup. They'd driven clean through the side opening of the temporary fencing, the section I hadn't finished reinforcing yet, and parked square in the middle of my freshly leveled pad. And they weren't just parked. 2 men in reflective vests were unloading cones, rebar, and what looked like a skid loader attachment. One of them, wearing a hard hat, walked past the camera and muttered, "This is supposed to be the staging area for the overflow lot, right?" I didn't even need to hear the answer. My chest was already tightening. I didn't yell. I didn't grab my rifle. I did what I knew would matter more. I hit record, grabbed the folder with my ownership documents, and called the sheriff. The dispatcher knew me by now. She didn't even ask many questions. By the time I pulled my truck up to the front gate, blue lights were already cresting the hill. I stepped out just as Deputy Sanchez and Sheriff Vaughn arrived. Sanchez had that look like someone who regretted not taking a desk job. Vaughn just nodded, cool and tired. "They're on your land again?" "Worse," I said, pointing toward the trucks. "They brought company." We rounded the corner of the property just as one of the workers was unloading a compactor. Karen was there too, clipboard in hand, wearing a headlamp like some HOA dungeon master. She looked up when she saw the flashlights. "Oh, officers," she called cheerfully. Perfect timing. The taller of the 2 workers looked genuinely confused. Ma'am, this guy says it's his land." I stepped forward. "That's because it is." Karen held up a laminated map, one I'd already seen. The altered one. The fake one. "According to this," she said, "this 12-foot strip has been community easement for decades. We're simply preparing a temporary parking zone for HOA guests during the upcoming festival weekend." Vaughn didn't blink. "Karen, this map's already under investigation by the zoning board. You've been notified of the complaint." She blinked just once, then smiled. "Well, no one told the contractors. They were scheduled weeks ago. It's a misunderstanding." The shorter worker turned and said, "Wait, so this isn't your land?" Karen hesitated. "It's under clarification." "I got an address from a Mrs. Hudson," the man said, pointing toward my fence. "She said this was HOA overflow and we were authorized for a 2-day leveling job." Sanchez stepped closer to them, pulled out his notepad. "You got a work order? Written authorization?" The man looked pale now. I've got an invoice, but no permits." She said the HOA handled that. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. That was my cue. I handed Vaughn a second copy of the drone photos, the official plat maps, and the flagged survey logs. "This is my land," I said, voice calm and steady. "Filed legally, recorded. I have a complaint already on record regarding a forged submission to the zoning board. And now she's brought in labor to alter my property without my consent." Vaughn flipped through the folder. He knew exactly what he was looking at. One of the workers took a step back and muttered, "I didn't sign up for this shit." The taller one turned to Vaughn. "Sir, we're leaving. We'll bill whoever hired us, but we're not touching a damn inch more." Karen's face twitched, just barely, but enough to drop the mask. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said, voice rising. "This land was always meant to be shared. There are maps, old ones that show—" "There are official maps," I cut in. "And then there's whatever you printed on your office copier." She turned on me with a look that could curdle milk. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said, stepping forward, "but I think the court's going to enjoy it." Vaughn nodded toward Sanchez. "Take statements from the workers. We'll need ID copies. And file a report under unlawful entry and suspected property damage." Karen gasped. "You can't possibly think—" "Ma'am," Vaughn said, "this is the third call we've had involving you and this property. You're not above the law, no matter what role you hold in your HOA." That got her. She stepped back, lips pressed tight, holding that laminated fraud like it was the Magna Carta. The contractors packed their things without saying another word. One of them walked past me on his way to the truck. "Sorry, man," he muttered. "We had no idea." I gave him a nod. "It's not on you." They drove off quietly, tail lights disappearing down the street like someone pulling a plug on the whole charade. Karen stood alone in the dust and silence, looking for a way to recover her posture. But there wasn't one. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just looked her in the eye and said, "Next time you trespass with heavy machinery, try not to get it on camera." Then I turned around and walked back to my house as the sheriff's cruiser idled behind me. The land was quiet again, for now. A week of silence followed that late-night standoff, and for a moment I almost believed Karen had backed off. Maybe the sheriff's warning finally hit home. Maybe she'd run out of gas, figuratively and literally, but I should have known better. Karen Hudson wasn't the kind of woman who gave up. She just changed tactics. It started innocently enough. A newsletter slipped anonymously into my mailbox, illegal by the way, printed on glossy paper with the HOA logo up top. Community alert, recent property dispute. No names, no facts, just vague fear-mongering about unauthorized land modifications and access obstructions that jeopardize emergency vehicle flow. The kicker? A dramatic call to action. Protect our community's shared access spaces. Say no to unlawful fencing. It was like reading propaganda from a petty dictator who'd lost her grip on the army. 2 days later, a group of neighbors, folks I'd barely exchanged more than a wave with, gathered in front of Karen's driveway with folding chairs and coffee cups, like it was some kind of HOA tailgate. Julia watched them from our window, arms crossed. "I'm going to bake something aggressive," she muttered, heading for the kitchen. I didn't respond. I had my own battle plan, but first I wanted to know how far she was taking this. So I took a walk. One of the flyers was taped to the community bulletin board near the mail kiosk. Another posted at the dog park gate. Same nonsense. But now, they included a QR code that led to a digital petition titled "Restore Access to Cedar Hollow Hills Shared Corridor." Under it, "Stop Land Seizure by New Resident." She didn't name me outright, but she didn't have to. When I checked the signatures, there were 8. Half of them were clearly her inner circle, neighbors who owed her favors or who genuinely believed the HOA was the law of the land. One signature caught my eye. Gerald Kane, the treasurer of the HOA. That name would come back to me later, loud and clear. I didn't panic. I didn't respond online. I went old school. I printed my own packet, documents, maps, screenshots, photos, and a formal statement titled, "Legal Boundaries Are Not Optional," a statement from the actual landowner. I dropped one at every door in the neighborhood. No threats, no sarcasm, just facts and certified records. Julia helped, deadpan as hell. Think the truth comes with banana bread, or should we go full cornbread offense? But that wasn't enough. Karen wasn't just lying. She was spending money to do it. That smelled like abuse of funds. And I had a hunch, so I made a call to Steve Lathrop, a guy I'd met during a grading project 2 years back. He used to be HOA vice president before he voluntarily resigned after clashing with Karen. He met me at a diner outside of town, wore the look of a man finally ready to talk. "She did this before," Steve said over coffee. "Not this exact stunt, but similar. Claimed part of a greenbelt was HOA property, tried to rezone it into a parking loop. Paid a landscaping company $8,000 out of discretionary funds. No vote, no notice." I leaned in. "You got proof?" He pulled out a flash drive. Board meeting minutes, email chains, billing records. I copied everything before I quit. Been sitting on it. I took it without hesitation. You sure you're okay going public with this? Steve smirked. Landon, if she torched your greenhouse plans, you're already halfway to martyrdom. Might as well burn her with you. That night, I combed through the data, and what I found was worse than I expected. Karen had paid contractors without HOA votes on at least 3 occasions, diverted over $18,000 to a company registered to her sister, on paper labeled as Community Beautification Services, filed internal reports that didn't match actual expenditures, marked certain funds as sensitive discretionary usage to avoid audit flags, and now she was trying to create an illegal parking lot on land that wasn't even in the HOA's jurisdiction. No, this wasn't just annoying anymore. This was fraud. I called Craig, my attorney. Time to go nuclear, I said. He laughed. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already drafted a complaint for the district attorney's office. You forward me the HOA fund data, and I'll attach it as Exhibit C. Exhibit A was the forged map. Exhibit B was the video of the trespass and contractor incident. Exhibit C would be the financials. It wasn't just about my land anymore. Karen had weaponized her position and siphoned funds under the radar for years, and if this community didn't know, they were going to find out now. The complaint was filed under alleged misappropriation of HOA funds, fraudulent zoning filings, and intentional trespass with property damage. Craig marked the box that read, Request for Investigation of HOA Fund Misuse. It was official. As the sun set that evening, I stood at the edge of my property, hands in my pockets, watching Karen's house. Lights were on, curtains open. She stood there, staring out, like she knew something had shifted. She was right. The war wasn't just about land anymore. I always knew it might come to court. I just didn't expect the day I walked into the Jefferson County Courthouse, I'd feel more calm than rage. Maybe it was because I'd spent the last 2 months watching my land get treated like a doormat. Or maybe it was because, after all Karen's theatrics, she was finally going to have to explain herself to someone who wasn't sipping HOA Kool-Aid. The courtroom was small. Civil Division C, beige walls, fake wood paneling, and a bailiff who looked like he ran a biker bar on weekends. Craig sat beside me in his usual steel gray suit, flipping casually through our evidence binder like he was reviewing a menu. Across the aisle sat Karen in a lavender pantsuit that probably cost more than my ATV. She wore pearls, carried a folder she never opened, and had a lawyer who looked freshly unwrapped from law school. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Thornton, opened proceedings quickly. We're here today on case Race v. Hudson pertaining to alleged falsified property records, unlawful entry, destruction of private property, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Karen's attorney stood up smooth as silk. Your Honor, this is a simple misunderstanding between neighbors. There was confusion over old community maps compounded by unclear signage and historic usage paths. My client regrets any accidental overstep, but there was no malice, no criminal intent. Craig leaned forward. Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate that not only was there clear and repeated trespass, but that the defendant deliberately filed forged cartographic documents to alter county zoning, diverted community funds without approval, and orchestrated unauthorized property damage under the false authority of her HOA position. Judge Thornton raised a brow. That's quite the list. Let's start with the land boundary claim. That was my cue. I took the stand and with Craig's guidance laid out every piece of the puzzle. The drone photos, the pre- and post-expansion GPS logs, the time-stamped footage of the fencing, the fake map Karen had submitted, overlaid with the official plat file from the county. Craig brought out David Ellis, a certified county geodetic surveyor, as our expert witness. He didn't waste time. These maps were doctored, he said, pointing to the discrepancies. The coordinate points were shifted manually. The formatting doesn't match the county standard. This was a manipulated document submitted under false pretense. Karen shifted in her seat. Her lawyer tried to object, claimed David was making interpretive assumptions. The judge overruled it without blinking. Then came the video. We showed the court footage of Karen's pickup rolling across my yard, the night she brought in the contractors, the statements from the confused workers. One of them had even signed a declaration Craig submitted, confirming Karen gave them instructions based on her ownership as HOA president. Then Craig dropped the financials. Your Honor, he said, we've also submitted bank records and internal HOA emails showing the defendant authorized the expenditure of $18,215 to a landscaping firm registered under her sister's name. No board vote, no community notice. Karen's face drained a full shade. Her lawyer squirmed. I just watched. The judge flipped through the exhibits slowly. Was any work ever performed for that invoice? No, Your Honor, Craig answered. In fact, the address on the invoice belongs to an empty lot in another county. The business doesn't exist. Karen finally spoke. That money was misfiled. I wasn't trying to steal. You mean misappropriated, Judge Thornton interrupted sharp, which is exactly what the criminal division will investigate. Let's stick to this case. By the time closing arguments began, it wasn't even a contest. Karen's team had stopped fighting the boundary line and shifted entirely to damage control. Their goal now was to keep this from going to a full-blown criminal case. The judge issued her ruling without recess. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Landon Race, on all counts. The defendant, Ms. Hudson, is ordered to pay $74,000 in damages, including the cost of property repairs, legal fees, and punitive restitution for the falsified map submission and unauthorized access. Karen's mouth fell open like someone had pulled the pin from her, but Judge Thornton wasn't done. In addition, she said, I'm forwarding this case to the district attorney's office for formal review of suspected financial fraud within the Cedar Hollow Hills HOA. You may be removed from your position pending the outcome. And just like that, the hammer fell. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Someone had leaked the filing, and now the local paper wanted a quote. I gave them a copy of the complaint and said, I just wanted to build a garden. That's all. Karen, she bolted to her car like a felon on bail. Later that week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but the minutes were made public afterward. Turns out 74% of the members voted to suspend Karen indefinitely pending internal investigation. Her treasurer resigned the next day. The community overflow parking project was declared null and void. And just like that, the woman who thought she owned the land, the street, and the neighborhood lost it all. But me? I still had my land. And now, a court ruling to prove it. If Karen thought the courthouse was the end of it, she hadn't been paying attention. The judgment may have slammed the gavel, but the real sentence was what followed in the days after. 2 mornings later, a moving truck appeared in Karen's driveway, not to pack up her things, but to drop off files. HOA board records, boxes of them. She stood there in a sweater and sunglasses, arms folded like a washed-up politician on house arrest. Her mailbox had been vandalized overnight. Someone spray-painted Fraud Queen in red across it. I didn't condone that kind of thing, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't smirk. What hit her harder than the fine was the vote of no confidence. The board held a special session, open to residents for the first time in years. They met in the community clubhouse, where I showed up early just to sit in the back and observe. I didn't say a word, but the people did. One by one, neighbors who'd once signed her petition stood up and admitted they felt pressured to support her. A mother of 3 said Karen threatened her with fines over a trampoline in the backyard. An elderly couple said she'd warned them about potential violations if they didn't vote her way. Then came Gerald Kane, the HOA treasurer who'd signed the infamous overflow lot invoice. He looked pale, hands shaking slightly as he read from a prepared statement. I was asked to sign off on budget reallocations without documentation. When I asked questions, I was told I was too new to understand how things work. I regret enabling that. That was the beginning of the unraveling. The board voted 5-0 to suspend Karen permanently. Her presidency was stripped. Her voting rights as a homeowner were suspended pending the criminal investigation. The county's DA had already issued a formal subpoena for the HOA's financial records. It wasn't just about me anymore. The whole neighborhood was waking up from a 2-decade nap. I kept my distance mostly, let them do their cleanup. I focused on my land, but that didn't mean I wasn't still watching. 3 nights later, I got a ping on my new motion detection system. I checked the feed. It wasn't Karen. It was a man in a maintenance uniform walking the perimeter with a clipboard. He stopped at the fence line, took photos, and marked something down. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and called out, "Can I help you?" He turned, startled. I was hired by the HOA. They wanted updated photos of the property line for their records. "Let me guess," I said. Karen sent that request before she got bounced. He nodded sheepishly. Honestly, probably. I was told to ignore anything that looks like a recent dispute. Yeah, well, tell your boss the dispute's legally resolved. And take this with you. I handed him a copy of the court ruling, laminated and stapled to a map. He blinked. Thanks. Make extra copies. She's gonna need 'em in prison. Word of Karen's downfall spread fast. Local news ran a short segment on the story. Title: HOA scandal in Cedar Hollow Hills. President accused of fraud land grab. They used a photo of her walking to court in sunglasses, face stiff as granite. I turned off the TV halfway through. It wasn't gloating. It was closure. But the weirdest part, once she was gone, people started talking to me like I'd lived there forever. Mrs. Dorset from 2 lots down brought over a rhubarb pie and apologized for not being neighborly. A couple from the next street offered to help me rebuild the irrigation system Karen ran over. One guy even asked if I'd consider running for HOA president. I nearly choked on my coffee. After what I just watched, I said, I'd rather eat drywall. Still, it felt different now. People waved when they passed. Kids rode bikes down the street again. Someone even started planting sunflowers at the dog park. It was like the whole neighborhood had been under a spell, and the curse finally broke. I spent that weekend finishing the real fence. Concrete posts, steel chain, locked gate, new cameras at every entry point. The last thing I added was a custom-made sign bolted to the center of the front gate. White background, bold black letters, private property. This is not your shortcut. This is your mistake. I didn't expect Karen to see it, not directly. Rumor was she was taking time away at her sister's place in Wyoming. But I knew the board had mailed her a certified copy of the court ruling, along with an invoice for the HOA funds she'd misused, with interest. I leaned against one of the posts, sipping a beer as the last light faded over the hills. It was finally quiet again, but this time the silence didn't feel vulnerable. It felt earned. 3 months passed. The soil had settled, the legal dust had cleared, and the only thing left of the war was the reinforced gate and the trail of wheel ruts that nature was finally erasing on her own terms. The greenhouse went up first, 12 by 20 polycarbonate panels anchored deep into concrete footers like I was expecting a Category 5 storm to roll through. Julia filled the raised beds with heirloom tomatoes and bell peppers. I installed a drip system that never leaked, never clogged, and never had a pickup run over it in the middle of the night. Funny how things work when nobody's sabotaging them. We built a small shed next, then a proper gravel loop for the trailer and ATV, followed by a solar setup that let me run half the property off-grid. It wasn't about going green, it was about control. Not having to rely on anyone, especially people with HOA logos on their bumpers. Karen's house still stood across the way, but it looked different now. Quieter, unattended. The windows stayed shut, the blinds drawn. Her grass went yellow. The hedges grew lopsided, untrimmed. No flags, no HOA newsletters. Just a silent husk of a woman who thought she ran the neighborhood and instead ran herself off the map. The rumors came in slow and strange. First, that she had been indicted on 2 counts, one for document fraud, the other for misuse of community funds. Then, her sister turned state's witness, submitting texts that showed Karen knew the landscaping work was fake. She'd called it easy money in one of the messages. A few weeks later, I saw a for sale sign go up on her lawn. Not the fancy kind, a standard whiteboard nailed to a stake, like an eviction notice in drag. Julie and I sat on the porch that night, watching a realtor take photos of the now empty property. She brought wine. I brought silence. Neither of us had to say it out loud. We won. But it wasn't just about Karen anymore. After her removal, the HOA actually changed. The board passed a bylaw that required member-wide votes on all expenditures over $500. They repealed the discretionary emergency fund clause, the same one Karen abused. They even published open financial reports for the first time in a decade. A neighbor I barely knew, Gregory 2 doors down, stopped by one afternoon to thank me. He said, "Most of us thought we were just stuck with her. You proved we weren't." I didn't say much. I wasn't trying to be a symbol. I just didn't like people trespassing. But if it helped others, so be it. One Sunday, I noticed something strange at the edge of my property. A small white envelope taped to the inside of my new gate. No name, no address. Inside was a handwritten note, shaky but unmistakably hers. I was wrong. I thought control meant safety. I see now it only made enemies. I hope this place lets you grow what I never could. K. No apology, no confession, but it was the closest Karen Hudson would ever come. I burned the note in the fire pit that night, not out of spite, just closure. The land didn't need her ghosts lingering. I stood at the top of the slope the next morning, coffee in one hand, Julia by my side. The mountains in the distance were just starting to catch sunlight. 7 acres of peace, every inch of it mine, and not a single tire track in sight.